Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Just quickly about the photographs. So these photographs were taken by Patrick Rangeley-Wilson. Thank you, Patrick. And they are of places that feature in or inspired our books in one way or another. So I think they're going to be 10 or 12 of them, and they're on a loop. So there's a quiz at the end. So whoever gets everyone right, and not just the place, but the reference to the particular text, and ideally the page in that book, there will be half a lager. Literature and landscape. Okay, so Rachel and I have known each other for a long while. We are good friends. I'm a great admirer of Rachel's work. We also have taught together at UEA.
We're sort of related by marriage, aren't we,
And-
as well?
and-
Not our marriage, but it's the sort of thing that happens in Norfolk, doesn't it? Normal for Norfolk, yes.
Exactly that. So we were discussing how we were going to run this, and just so you know, we're going to have a discussion. We'll talk about genre because I'm really intrigued by it at some point. And we will do some readings. But to kick this off, I'm going to ask Rachel a question about place, because I was born in Norfolk. Rachel wasn't. So one way or another, Rachel is the interloper. So
Well, that's very nice way to put it, isn't it? I prefer blow-in.
Blow-in, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Not a term that I use very often. So, Rachel, what does it mean to you, Norfolk? What has it meant to you in relation to your fiction?
Well, I moved to Norfolk 24 years ago from London with my husband, who is from Norwich. And so I was experiencing it very much from an outsider. And when I came to write books that were set in Norfolk, I found that, again, I was often writing from the outsider's point of view, and quite often that it seemed quite natural that the characters in the books were people who had moved to Norfolk, come to Norfolk, and like me, were seeing it through an outsider's eyes. Possibly a little romanticised, because we talk very much about how beautiful Norfolk is and how remote and how full it is of artistic people and colourful people and all these kinds of people who I suppose belong in the landscape, who have risen out of the landscape to some extent, seem to feed into my books.
And of your, I mean, I think you've had 13 novels published so far.
Yes.
14th is coming out next year. How many are set in Norfolk, or we can bring in Suffolk actually?
We can, yes. I think there's 3 that are principally set in Norfolk and 3 that are principally set in Suffolk. But I've found that in writing books that have other settings, quite often Norfolk particularly will creep in as quite often as a sort of haven for characters. Somebody's divorced parent will have fled to Norfolk to start a new life and so on. So I think of it as a very friendly place, I suppose, and a place of safety, actually.
What also intrigues me about your work, though, the work set in Norfolk, is that you tend not to name or set your characters and in where they're living and where they're moving around, etc., in real places. You make up names of villages and houses, etc. I noticed that obviously Norwich, etc., features one way or another. But I'm just wondering why you feel that it's sort of necessary to do that, what it enables you to do imaginatively, I guess.
It gives me a lot of creative freedom. The places that are real feed into the books in that they features of them are added to the picture that I've got in my mind. So I might have a round towered church, for instance, that I will put in my imaginary village, or a walled garden that's perhaps inspired by real life ones, such as at Felbrigg. But I will quite happily move things around to become an imaginary world, because it just gives me the freedom to stop tripping over myself all the time as to whether I've described something correctly, or and enables me to concentrate on the characters and their relations to the landscape, which I think is quite different from you, Henry, because I think of your books as being more social realism sometimes, that your characters have sort of grown up in the places where they are. And I mean, are they people who are content to be where they are, or are they rebelling against it? Or
they haven't grown up very well, actually. quite a lot of them, and increasingly so. Yeah, it's an interesting idea. Hadn't we thought about the characters, sort of, how they feel about the places or how they've grown up in those places? Apart from those characters have always seemed to me to be intrinsic to those places. So they're operating, they're existing as much because of the place as they are because of themselves, if that makes sense. And they wouldn't be who they are without those places. But perhaps, unlike you, I pick real places for that is the fiction I've written in Norfolk, which is probably a bit like you. It's about a third of my output, or fourth of my novels. Yes. And it's sort of the characters I've used to depict aspects of Norfolk, if you like, have changed as well with the genre, or the genres I've been moving through. And as Vicky said, I began writing literary fiction. I'm not entirely sure what that is, and maybe we can talk about that a bit later. But I suppose to me then, what it meant, and this is a long while ago now, it was fiction that was sort of modern, contemporary, of the moment. It was not necessarily geared towards a particular audience. It was non-genre, if you like, rather than going for a particular genre. And those novels, I think the first two novels I wrote, Galston, which is set in Galston, obviously, or perhaps not obviously, but it is. I was born in Galston, so I thought, well, why not set my first novel there? And it was about characters who I knew, family characters actually, who I knew really quite well. And there's a lot of real people in there, albeit they're not around anymore, thank God. But I very much, that old adage, write what you know. I knew that world. It didn't make me comfortable at all, which is why I think I picked it. I have this idea that writers tend to write away from really their own experience, or they write towards it and really explore it. And that book was absolutely getting stuff out of my own sense of where I came from, my own sensibility. So it was writing towards really stuff that I needed to explore. But and the novel I did after that, Bank Holiday Monday, which normally I whenever I do book events in Norfolk or North Norfolk, I often read from that book, because it's set just up the road in the windmill in Burnham Over East Stave. This family go and spend, or extended family go and have a long weekend there. And that novel is called Bank Holiday Monday, and everything sort of goes disastrously wrong, but it didn't go that disastrously wrong to make it into a crime narrative as I now know it. I missed a trick there, but those characters were I guess, civilized people in one way or another, and then things sort of got an awful lot darker I guess, as I thought more about the sort of work that I was attracted to, sort of literature, contemporary writing, the sort of places I wanted to write about.
Yeah. Well, would you say that there are any books of yours in which the place, the setting, has inspired, been the first point of inspiration, I suppose?
Well, that's yeah. So I'd like to ask you that question as well.
Yeah.
So just quickly, when I teach, I've taught creative writing for a long while. I always I'm a firm believer in the character comes first. The character is absolutely key to this. But everyone writes differently, everyone creates differently, and lots of people will think of the place first. But to me, the characters come before the place. But the characters, one way or another, are a product of that place. But the other thing I like to think is that the way I write, those characters are seeing the place. It's not me. So the versions of the places that I write about, one way or another, are in a fictional world that my characters are exploring, are walking around. Even though those places are real, Great Yarmouth, for instance, or King's Lynn, or Norwich, or Norfolk, nevertheless, they are fictional constructs. And the characters are doing the observing, they're doing all the sensory stuff. It's not me. And so Rachel, in relation to the same question, what comes first, the setting or the characters? And also, I'd also like to just add to that, if that's okay. Setting can also be period, historical, which of course you cover in all your novels.
Yes, which I suppose is that the main point I would want to make is that quite a few of my books have a present narrative and a past narrative, and the present narrative is really interrogating the past, in that a character in the present is perhaps solving some mystery in the past, or making a connection with some past family story, for instance. And I find place then very, very useful for making a connection between the historical and the present. And quite often also, when I am thinking about starting a new book, and I haven't necessarily got a particular idea in my head, sometimes it will be going to find somewhere, quite by accident usually, that almost gives me shivers down the back of my spine, because I can feel the past in it, not in a spooky, ghostly way. I'm not that sort of character, but that I can imagine things that used to happen there. I mean, an example might be, actually, I've already mentioned the walled garden. I get that feeling when I go to Felbrigg and walk round the garden there, that if you've got this enclosed world where things which must have seen all sorts of activities and stories and people, and people happy and sad and so forth, and it's then a matter of thinking, who were the people who might have been here, and quite often the place will also be what we call a liminal space, which means almost a connection between past and present that I will use to provide atmosphere and enable me to go back quite naturally into a past story. Not all my books are like that, but that I could certainly say that of A Place of Secrets and Last Letter Home, which are both set in Norfolk. With One Moonlit Night, both the narratives are set at the same time in the Second World War, and it's a husband and a wife trying to find each other. And the part that's set in Norfolk is a useful space, because in going to this old manor house where she lives with her husband's relatives, she's able to find out about his past secrets that have happened in this place. So that is another fictional village and manor house that I've sort of made out of rags of here and there, and imagined it to be near Sheringham.
That brings us to, I think we'd love to hear some of that in a minute, but just one question on this. Your novels have, by and large, mysteries in them.
Yes.
For want of a better term. I love that term. I love that idea. I mean, to me, fiction revolves around questions. It revolves around reveals. It revolves around things that we want to know but don't yet know. How conscious are you of putting such ideas and tropes into your fiction? Because you do it in a very, very skillful way.
I suppose I do it in quite a natural way. For me, writing is all about suspense, about bringing the reader with you and for them to be turning the pages, wanting to know what happens next. And I think these days, readers do often expect a reveal, don't they? It's a very popular way of writing a book, and I just find it very natural and enjoyable to write it that way. And sometimes I don't know what the reveal is going to be when I start the book. It shows itself at the point it needs to.
Which means you should come over to the dark side and
write crime.
Rachel.
Yeah.
Would you like to read an extract for us?
Yes, I will. So this is from One Moonlit Night. And Maddie, who is the wife in this story, has arrived in this village near Sheringham, and she's trying to accommodate herself to the place, and she's already been given various clues about her husband's childhood in this place. And this piece I'm about to read is really about creating atmosphere, but also about revealing Maddie's character, something about her own upbringing. And I will also say that there are various bits in it which you might say, oh, yes, that's very Norfolk. Let's see if you do. So, Maddie, seeing the round tower of the church rising above the trees, decided to investigate. Gusts of wind assailed her as she lifted the latch of the lich gate and entered the churchyard. A gravel path led to the south porch of the simple flint church with pointed arched windows. Daffodils pushed up through the straggling grass between the graves, and the air smelled of earth and green things. The caws of rooks came from the swaying trees all around, and Maddie's spirits rose. Inside the whitewashed porch, she dutifully secured the bird screen behind her and consulted a notice board on the wall. Her eye passed over a list of services, the name of the rector, and details of a jumble sale to be held in aid of war orphans. Then she twisted the iron ring in the heavy oak door until something lifted with a loud clunk, and the door swung inwards. It was the stillness of old churches that she loved, she recollected as she stood in the gloom. The silence was rich, as though the air was filled with all the words of prayer and comfort that had been spoken here, the traces of music that had played and hymns sung. She breathed in the smell of old wood and candle wax, so familiar. Her childhood had been full of churches, for Norwich had many, and she had loved the soaring Gothic beauty of its cathedral. This church was humble, with only a dozen row of pews on either side of a central aisle, and a white-clad communion table at the far end beneath a triptych of stained glass. But it bore the marks of love of generations of worshippers. Maddie wandered about, glancing at the memorial plaques, running her finger over a pew end with a blunted carved face and thinking how restful it was. "Have you seen our angels?" a voice came. "Oh, She turned to see a studious old man with a shining bald pate and wisps of silver hair above a clerical collar, who had emerged from behind a curtain at the back of the church. "No, I haven't," she said, and glanced up, following the line of his pointing finger. High above, where each pair of rafters met the spine of the roof, a small carved angel nestled. Each was different, one with folded wings, another playing a lute. Like the grotesques on the pew ends, however, their faces had been damaged. "What happened to them?" she asked. The Puritans didn't appreciate them as much as we do, I'm afraid. I'm the rector here, Olwyn Claremont," and he held out his hand.
Thank you. Just a question here in relation to writing a dual narrative, because obviously Maddie is, if you like, the protagonist, the key perspective of the earlier timeline, and then we have a more up-to-date, well, not up-to-date, still in the 1970s, isn't it?
In One Moonlit Night, it's actually what's happening to the husband elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, but Maddie is focusing or being
I know
channeled
what you mean.
via,
Yes.
Maddie. Yeah.
Yep.
So my point being, in relation to dual narratives, how do you manage to, if you like, balance each narrative thread? Does that concern you, making sure that each both have the right drive, the right pull, and what makes you choose those characters?
Well, that's several questions.
It is.
But again, it happens quite organically. I write one part and then it seems to flow into another part, and likewise all the way through. So the narratives are chasing each other, really. One of the tricks is not to go into the second narrative too quickly, really, because you have to root the reader in one before you take them off somewhere else. On the other hand, you shouldn't leave it too late either, because it sort of people are surprised when it finally does come about. That's sort of simple structural stuff, really. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the writing of crime novels, because I think that they must be so intricately put together to manage the clues, if you like, and to keep the big reveal to the end. You know.
Well, I mean, there are ways of looking at it. A series of questions, and then perhaps there might be one big question that covers the whole text, the whole narrative, the whole story, and then underneath that, if you imagine umbrellas, there's smaller and smaller umbrellas, smaller and smaller questions, and in a way you can generate suspense by laying out a particular idea. You know, who's that person who's just walked into the room, and then not answering, delaying the answer for some time, and you keep doing that. But you have to be careful, because if you do that too much, then the reader will get a little fed up and think they're just being sort of toyed with. You know, to write authentic, I guess what you'd call, you know, more traditional crime narratives or police procedurals, you know, which rely pretty much on investigative work, rely on a cop of some sort or an amateur sleuth. You know, that stuff is really difficult. The stuff that comes more easily to me is what I call noir, which is really about sort of, you know, you begin a novel in a sort of bad place and things only get worse. is one way of looking at it. You know, to me, writers like James M. Cain or Jim Thompson or Ted Lewis are writers that are exploring things in really dark but also compelling ways, and using prose that is of a level that is every bit as literary as what we might think of other or more recognised literary writers. But for me, I've struggled with the form, the terminology, my understanding of it. It changes.
It seems to me, in your Yarmouth trilogy, that it's the sort of novel that is as much about the community and the setting as the characters and the storyline. and that kind of crime level novel very much is about finding out, how a community works and what's gone wrong with it, and so forth. And I suppose that I wondered if that was a time to ask you to read from
So
Red Hot
thank
Front.
you.
Yeah.
So my I wrote a Yarmouth trilogy under a pseudonym called Harry Brett a few years back. But before we get to that, I wrote a novel called My Criminal World, which was about a crime writer who was struggling to write his next novel. He'd been quite successful, but he wasn't very good at writing violence. And writing violence on the page, particularly, he really struggled. So his characters would sort of die off page, and his agent would keep ringing him up saying, this is just like really boring. There's no sort of blood and gore. You're meant to be a crime writer. You're failing. So anyway, I took that as a premise, and I wrote a novel about a crime writer struggling to write his novel. And the novel he was struggling to write, he also writes. It's in this book. So basically, we have the writer. He's called David Slavitt, and he's writing or trying to write a novel, a crime novel, and trying to make it as sort of bloody and grim as possible. But he sort of keeps failing a bit. But he's also keep questioning what's going on. But in the meantime, crimes sort of tend to happen around his real life, if you like, if you can bear with me on this one. So I like to think of it as a psychological thriller wrapped around a crime fiction or a police procedural. So I'll just read you very quickly the beginning, and this is how it goes. Indeed, because it's what's known as metafictional. It's about a writer writing. Part one, the subtitle is The Wrong Beginning. As ever, I'm probably staring out of the window at flowers, at foliage anyway, a few straggly roses, clematis, possibly ferns, perhaps a vine maybe, and plenty of other stuff, weeds notably. Or I'm looking at the sky through the long, slim, slightly grimy panes above the French windows, watching clouds build and threaten, while urging my mind to race off elsewhere. Or I'm just looking at my screen, my chapped, chubby hands hovering lamely over the keyboard. Perhaps I'm glancing at the books and paperwork stacked up on my desk, the mounds of receipts and bills, invoices and remittance slips, contracts and invitations, the odd bit of fan mail too, having arrived the old-fashioned way via my publishers and through the letterbox. I like to hang on to these cards, these letters. Some, I guess, have been sitting there for a while. So in many ways, while trying to avoid these things that will never get properly dealt with or filed, and trying to concentrate, trying to think about what I do best while panicking a little because a deadline is looming, more bills have to be paid, and my brand enhanced, an image appears as if from nowhere. Thank God. Not, of course, that I believe in one. In my game, this then is how I'm going to begin it. First light, Christmas morning, a thin, freezing fog was drifting in from the sea. Across the tide line, the frosted dunes, and curling around the decrepit hotels and guest houses, the long since shut and boarded arcades and amusements, a fun fair from another era lost further up the Golden Mile. He crossed the road, his dog trotting obediently by his side. Out of habit, he looked behind him, in front again, scanned every which way. Not that he could see far, but far enough to tell he was the only fool about at this time and in this place. Why he liked it. His grey Hugo Boss puffer was zipped tight, his orange beanie pulled low, yet still the air was getting straight to his bones. Once on the sand, Baz, his black and tan boxer, immediately bounded out of view, increasing his pace, not because he was worried about the dog, but to try to generate some warmth. He headed straight towards the sea on a faint path. They always went the same way, across this area of outstanding natural beauty. How it had been designated as such was a mystery. Baz, he shouted at last, where the hell are you?
It's quite a challenge, I think, when you're writing about a place, not simply to give long descriptions. Seeing places through the character's eyes is quite important, isn't it? Sometimes, but most of us find our surroundings fairly mundane as we're moving through them, and you're not necessarily thinking as you go that what colour the paint is on the walls, or what furniture there is in the room, or that sort of thing. And yet one has to give the reader enough to give a sense of a place. Do you find that a particular challenge?
It's a challenge. It's a challenge if you're trying to write sort of fast-pacey prose text stories, because if you describe or over-describe particular places, scenes, you're slowing the narrative right down, and it's a fine line between getting it right and perhaps overdoing it. So I'm consciously thinking of pace, and probably to a degree sort of less is more. So you try and make things really sharp and succinct. But then the other thing, of course, and a lot of crime writers, face this issue, and a lot of writers, obviously, but crime possibly a bit more, because we think of crime writers, we think of their series, Rebus in Edinburgh, etc., or and those texts, those series are so in tune with those places. But what does it mean if you're from Edinburgh and you're reading that book, for instance? So I think you have to think about it. You are making, you're writing for someone who knows a place really, really well. I might say here now, how many of you live in Great Yarmouth? And that's like feeling not many hands will go up. But nevertheless, I'm writing it for people who know Great Yarmouth really, really well, but also people who don't know it at all. And it's this idea of sort of defamiliarizing the familiar and trying to see things in it that actually are new to people who know it really well. That's
very, very good point. You see, I wouldn't dare try and set a book in Great Yarmouth without doing a huge amount of research first, because I would feel that there were plenty of readers who knew it from the inside better than I do.
And that's a whole nother day doing the research down there.
Yes.
But how do you approach description, Rachel, and also historical description? Because you must do a lot of research.
Yeah, I have to do a fair amount of historical research, yes, and I actually find, as well as visiting places and so forth, I actually find reading memoirs and novels of the period actually more interesting than dusty tomes that give you lots of facts, because it is, after all, the human interest that one is after. Both the pieces that I'm reading tonight, the one I read just now and the one I'm going to read, are sort of fairly reflective, so you have the sense of a character going into a new place and being enchanted or whatever by it, so that there's a bit more leeway there to put in a bit more description, I think. But Henry's right about something is much more fast-paced. Once one's established an atmosphere and hopefully rooted the reader in the place the story is going to occur, then you don't find yourself dropping in so much description as you go, I find.
And that goes for a description of characters as well, rather than, and also just places.
Yeah.
So the line I like, the great late American crime writer Elmore Leonard used to say that you should be able to see what a character looks like just from how they speak. And that always struck me. In other words, the dialogue can do.
It's a challenge, yes.
Can do a lot of that work.
Yeah, stripped down. But it's very interesting, isn't it, that the crime novels, for instance, or there are particular places like Edinburgh and Rebus and so on, where actually the place, the setting, is like a character in the book. That's often particularly true of crime novels, but we could probably sit here and trade names of authors, Dickens's London or whatever.
But are they really, those places, or are they, as I sort of implied earlier, an author's construct? And I think
Well, they have to be an author's construct.
Yeah.
Yes. Each will do it different, and it's stylised and.
We're building imaginary worlds for our characters to inhabit, even though those worlds, are reflective or inspired by real places.
Yeah.
Would you like to read your?
I think I will. Yes, thank you. So this one is from A Place of Secrets, which is set in an estate, a house and grounds, which I've imagined to be near Holt. And in the present, it's the story of a young woman, an auctioneer, who is invited to value a collection of astronomical instruments in this house that belonged to an astronomer who owned the house at the end of the 18th century. And she's going to discover the story of this man and his little daughter. So this is, in the grounds of the estate is an old folly, which is a tall, thin tower, which is inspired by the Westwick Tower near Worsted, which is sort of half ruinous, and I had to go and slash a lot of nettles to go and look at. But here is Jude, as she is called, exploring the fictional tower for the first time. As she climbs, the darkness thickened and her skin prickled. She transferred her hands to the steps above and walked on all fours like an animal, her sense of balance gone, so that every few steps she felt as though she was falling backwards. She counted the stairs, 9, 10, 11. They were comfortably deep, not too high, 15, 16. She passed into a little patch of light from a window like an arrow hole. She peered out, but all she could see was light glinting on foliage. On she went, and her heart plunged in her chest as her hand missed its hold. A brick had gone. She edged round the gap carefully with her foot. 29, 30. What made her attempt this madness? 39, 40. Now a pale, drear light filled the air. She must be nearly there. 45, 46, 47. She was cold now, shivering with nerves. Another 10 steps. She must be nearly at the top. And suddenly she emerged into a little round room. She sat on the floor, trembling, trying to calm herself and take in her surroundings. The floor, like the rest of the folly, was brick. Wooden shelves and cupboards, some split and rotten, lined the walls. There were 4 small windows, spaced at equal distances round the room, one for each compass point, she thought, and a ladder in the middle that went up to what appeared to be a small trapdoor. Once, perhaps, the windows had been glazed, but now they were open to the elements. Rays of sunlight poured in through one, and from the forest all around came an ecstasy of birdsong. Under the sunny window were a table and chair, both modern folding ones. Someone had been working there, for they had left several sheets of paper and a reporter's notebook. She got to her feet and aisled over to discover newspaper articles printed from the internet and read about an expected meteor shower. The notebook was filled with scrawled notes and diagrams, and suddenly she felt that she wasn't just trespassing on someone else's land, but intruding on something more personal, their work. 200-odd years ago, this was where Anthony Wickham had worked. Now someone else came up here to think about stars. There was a strong sense of these people's presence. She felt uncomfortable, as though she should apologise and leave. Crossing the floor back to the stairs, she passed objects on the shelves. There were a couple of paperback books, curled with damp, a pen pot with a spray of dusty pencils. There were odder things, too, a great slice of napped flint, the head of an axe, or another tool, she supposed, picking it up and examining it. A pair of men's spectacles glared at her, the tortoiseshell frames scuffed and dull. The elderly binoculars hanging on a nail nearby proved irresistible. She walked round the windows with them one by one, looking for a view. Only through one could she see anything but trees. Amazingly, this window gave onto a vista of Starborough Hall, like a doll's house in the distance. She scrubbed at the grimy lenses with spit and the hem of her shirt, and looking again, could make out the library and the tiny figure of Robert walking away from his car and under the arch. It surprised her that she could see the house from the tower, but not the tower from the house. She wondered if this had always been the case, or if the growth of trees had lately made it so.
Rachel, you've been very successful. When you are writing a new book, do you think now you are writing a Rachel Hore novel? And what might that be?
Yes. I write really how it comes out and just pretend I have confidence that it will come out all right. But it is very much my voice, I suppose, behind the voices of the protagonists and so on. I suppose I have a certain way of doing things. I find there's plenty of challenge with each book, that there's something new I'm engaging with. There's once or twice I've written books that are inspired by real life stories, and I found that quite interesting to do, as to how to inhabit real historical characters and all the difficulties associated with that. But I suppose what comes out, I think, applies to any writer, really, that you can say, yes, I recognise that writer's style. Is that something that, I mean, even though you're writing different types of books, would you say that?
Well,
it's
I've written quite a lot of books and quite a lot of quite different books. But when a few years back I thought, okay, I'm going to try and write a crime series. I love the idea of a crime series. I started writing this series set in Great Yarmouth about a crime family, the Goodwins, and the first one in the series, Time to Win, begins when Tatiana Goodwin learns that her husband has died in suspicious circumstances. He basically was a local crime boss, and she immediately decides, well, I'm going to, take over from where he left off and, do a much better job of it and be a far more successful crook than he ever was. Now, I got that idea from talking to a top criminal barrister who defended every big crook in this country, one way or another, who was hauled up. And he said to me, the thing is about, because I was telling him this premise, he said the thing about female crime bosses or gay crime bosses is that they have to be so much tougher, so much harder, so much more ruthless than the blokes, because they've come from a place that is genderized. It is really difficult to make your mark. I was really intrigued by that one way or another. But anyway, I started writing this series, and my agent said, "Oh well, what about let's relaunch you? Let's do it under a pseudonym." So I thought, okay, let's use a pseudonym. So I chose a pseudonym, Harry Brett, for various actually quite close family reasons. And I thought, and when I began the series, I thought, okay, I'm Harry Brett now. I can write as Harry Brett, crime writer, rather than Henry Sutton, writer, whoever he might be.
Did that give you a different
well, it did to begin with.
Approach,
it certainly at the beginning, the first in the trilogy, I thought, okay, yeah, I'm a different sort of person here, at least behind the screen or on the keyboard, and it allowed me to write in a different way. But interestingly, as the series went on, second, third book, old habits crept in. Henry Sutton kept coming in there in the syntax, in the prose, and the sentences were getting longer, and they were getting more descriptive, and they were full of interiority, and going back to that old literary stuff, and the pace had gone, and all the rest of it. I don't want to do my own work down, but nevertheless, it was quite interesting that actually trying to write in a certain way is really, really hard. And I think, the writers I really admire and the crime writers are those who do it completely authentically. It is them. And now I've freed up and I just write whatever I want. And I'll quickly read a bit from the second in the series where a bit more of me is coming back into the prose. This is the beginning of the second novel in the series, and it features one of Tatiana Goodwin's grown-up children. Wind was coming in waves, not gusts. Up over the beach it pounded, whining and rattling on through the rotten struts of the ravaged roller coaster. The second drop was the steepest, the beams looking like they'd knock your head off if you didn't duck. Because the wind was a northeasterly, it then slanted across acres of wasteland where once stood a go-kart track, so he had heard, and later an oil supply ship depot. Now raised, the contaminated ground was waiting for the super casino. It had been some wait already. Boom. The wind was as wet and raw as the North Sea, June for you in this part of the world. Picking up strength over the land, it shot across South Beach Parade before funneling through the potholed streets of boarded-up pubs, the odd dismal line of small terraced houses and endless semi-industrial buildings. There were a few Victorian warehouses and smokehouses still standing, including his mother's, theirs. Forget it, Zach said aloud, shaking his head in the storm of ages, not sure what that meant, what was happening to time. But there was no one to hear him anyway, no one was in sight. He scanned the road, the nearby buildings, the wind watering his eyes, shadows creeping out from the dying night. Waster, he shouted. He had been left out on his Todd high and dry. Hi, not funny. Even less of a joke was the fact that his car was at the other end of town, as if he'd been able to drive. His head was buzzing, his stomach churning on empty. Unclenching the fingers of his right hand, he reached into the front pocket of his jeans for his phone. He wanted not the time, but the way out of here, even though part of his brain must have known exactly where he was. They were his streets, his history, how it was passed on from generation to generation. Nevertheless, his internal GPS was not as acute as it should have been. Bollocks. His eyes were too watery to read the screen, anyway.
Do you think we ought to ask if the audience have any questions
I think
for
we
us?
have absolutely got to that point. So, does anyone have a question?
I have a really flippant question.
There's a mic coming.
I think I heard I have a really flippant question. Is that correct?
I do have a really flippant question, yes. Galston's Doggy Diner. When did the demise of that occur, or is it really still there?
You know what? I'm not entirely sure I know what you're talking about.
Is it one of the
It's
photographs?
one of the pictures.
Okay.
Yes.
That would help if I looked what was going on and paid more attention to land and landscape and place. I guess so. Patrick took the pictures recently, so yes, it is absolutely still there.
Right.
It doesn't feature though.
Right.
Nevertheless, but Galston does.
Right. Thank you very much.
Do you get asked? I'm asking up here. I won't ask you. Keith from the bookshop. We get people asking us all the time about Rachel's books. Where they actually are set. Do you get asked all the time? And we went out with Ellie Griffiths last year out on a coach around North Norfolk, going to all of the Ruth Galloway things. And people were so excited to find out where she supposedly actually lived. Do you get asked all those questions?
Well, actually, no, I don't. I don't know why. I haven't got a series of books, I suppose, that are set in one single place with one single character who appears in all the books. I think that is a much more grounded thing from Ellie's point of view. But I have also set books in. The latest one is actually set in Cornwall, which is another place that's close to my heart. I've set books in London, in France, bit of Italy, So there isn't quite that unity of a series of books.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because of one of you saying you're a blow-in and one of you saying that you're from here, the extent to which you think that sometimes the best people to tell stories are those who aren't from the place at all. And I think that we get very het up on authenticity and who has the right to tell a story. And I sometimes think that the people least suited to telling a story are the people who are from a place because they can't actually kind of see it, because it's just their normal. And I wondered how you feel about that.
I think one answer, and Henry might supplement this, is that I find it, I think a lot of writers find it easier to write about a place they know well after they've left it, and they're looking at it from a distance. But I don't know.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I've done that. I've read a book called Get Me Out of Here, set in London, the year after I moved out of London. So that is for sure. But I think, I'm not sure whether your question is sort of tipping towards ideas of, we talk a lot about this at work in my institution, about lived experience, and really, that is what you should be exploring, that's what you should be writing about, and then moving into ideas of cultural appropriation. Only certain people write about certain things, certain cultures, because they are from there. I mean, to me, if you're a fiction writer, you can write about whatever you want. I mean, it is you're writing imaginary fiction, you're writing made up stuff. Okay, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be sensitive to all sorts of ideas and concepts and cultures, but nevertheless, the fictional world, the fictional place, which is why I write fiction, not non-fiction, is to me and should be limitless. And you pick certain places, certain characters, because at the moment of that point, you are interested in them. They come to you in one manner or another. And I do think, writers one way or another are, or can be, quite prescient, quite pertinent. They're observers, okay, for want of a better word. And so they are conscious of certain things that are going on, and they think about things, or some writers do, quite deeply. And they, these forces, one way or another, end up coming out on the page. I'm not sure that quite answers your question.
But we know instances, well, I certainly do, of writers who have followed their own instincts and written what they want to write about, and then find they can't get the book published.
Yeah. That's it.
Can I make a comment about, you say you use fictional, to Rachel, use fictional places. I think that's a very good idea. I get very irritated sometimes reading Ellie Griffith's books, or there's one called Swanton Morley by another crime writer, places I know well, and they seem to be able to nip around the county in no time at all. So they get from King's Lynn to Holme they haven't obviously heard of the A149. And Swanton Morley, they were going to the Broads, and in no time at all. And that I find slightly irritating. So I think using fictional is a very good idea.
Or perhaps do a bit more research.
Yes. I was always surprised when I have used a real place. In my memory, even if I think I know the place quite well, things do seem closer to one another. I set part of a novel in Southwold once, and when I actually paced out the journey that I'd written and the book was all printed and so on, I realised to my horror that it was actually a long, long time to walk the length of one side of the harbour. So that is, I don't know whether that's a failure of the writer's imagination or just a tick of it. I don't know. Were you bothered by it?
Yes.
You were bothered by it, yes.
I think it's important to get stuff right. I read a novel a while ago called Flying, and the whole novel was set on an aeroplane. 2 flights, one between London and New York, and the second half between New York and London. And it was designed to be read in real time, so going to New York took a bit longer than from New York to London, because obviously the jet stream, and it was told from the perspective of 7 different characters, including who were all cabin crew and the pilot and co-pilot. And I did a huge amount of research on that. And you know, I even had there's I don't know whether it still exists. There's a bookshop in London that was for basically for pilots, and you could buy maps of the cockpit of a 747, and I had that on my desk. And I you know, at the end of writing that book, I really felt that, you know, you in your sort of weird nightmares or dreams, you know, someone pops up and says, well, the pilots have had an emergency. Is anyone here can fly a plane? And I could have got in there and given it a pretty good go. I think there's a question over here.
Yes, do you use visual diagrams for your plot development? And also, do you have a sense of the visual appearance of the characters in your books, like photographs of people, real people or imagined people? Do you have those pinned to your writing room wall?
Rachel, do you want to go first?
Occasionally I will do that, but I will drop using them quite quickly if it's the face of a character or whatever. Sometimes it's useful just to get using a real character's face out of a magazine or whatever, just to sort of get going, but then I won't need it after the first chapter because I've got my fictional version of them. Yeah.
I never use sort of character sketches as such, or visual images, or pictures, whatever, to try and remind me. You know, the characters, I think, when you come to, or when I begin to write a novel, I know them really well. I don't need those sorts of reminders. And when I come to planning it, no, I don't visually structure a novel, but I do know how long it will be. For instance, whether it be 60,000 words, 80,000 words, I know roughly the structure, particularly the timeline over how many days, weeks, years it will take place, you know, and over the years, my novels have become shorter in the sense of the narrative space they occupy. So mostly they take place over about 5 days. And I'm comfortable with that. There's one in the middle here. And there's one right at the back, yeah.
Thank you both, really interesting. A question, you've both had obviously very long careers. I mean that in a very positive way. I was wondering whether or not you found that the publishing industry has changed over that time, and whether or not you're feeling any pressure to write your books in a different way or present in a different way, particularly the pressure to have something dramatic happen very early on in your novels.
Well, I've been writing for about 20 years, I suppose, and in that time, public taste has definitely changed. The genres come and go, don't they? I would say that both crime and this kind of historical drama that I write do seem to be fairly constant. So we're quite fortunate in that way. But otherwise, I don't find that I always have written books that have a little bit of a twist and so on. I haven't felt pressurised to do it differently. I don't think I'm admiring of writers who do go with the flow, as you were, and I find it very interesting, for instance, what we used to call chick lit writers, who were writing the Bridget Jones era at the end of the 90s, and a lot of the best of those writers are still around, and their books sort of grow with their own life experience, I suppose, and they sort of...
Good writers, you know, or good writing, hopefully manages to get out there eventually or somehow. Now, it's not easy. You know, my first novel came out, I think, 30 years ago. And obviously, you know, I've spent the last nearly 20 years teaching creative writing at UEA, and a lot of my students have become, you know, amazing prize winners, global successes, names you'll have all heard of. That still happens, but it's really difficult. It was never easy. Publishing is really weird. I think the industry doesn't quite know what it wants to do at the moment, and I think the digital revolution, if we want to call it that, is going to play a major part. I think their avenues, writers, perhaps more commercially orientated, more genre-orientated writers, are finding ways to publish directly, digitally. Things like Kindle Direct Publishing have transformed a lot of people's sort of working practices and publishing lives. You know, the traditional publishers, yes, they're still there, they're still publishing, you know, still publishing well. But I think, you know, the really exciting stuff, and by that I mean the really interesting avant-garde work that is doing different things, is now by and large being published by small indie publishers. It's difficult to get that work noticed unless they win prizes. There are one or two prizes like the Goldsmith Prize that recognise, you know, new work being created in new ways, and they're doing really different and interesting things with, say, the novel. But you know, maybe it was always really hard to get that sort of work published and noticed. I don't know what will happen to the industry over the next few years. I have a slight feeling it will go the way that TV and music's gone. Things will be streamed. In a way, it's happening already with Audible books, because you can sign up and you get so many Audible books a month, etc. I think the next step will be Amazon will launch, you know, a subscription service that you can have as many books to download as you want over a certain period. And then I don't know what publishers are going to do, or traditional publishers, but from my experience and knowledge of them, and a lot of my friends work in the industry, we have a lot of connections institutionally with publishers. I slightly feel that the main publishers, and I know there might be a few agents and former publishers or publishers here who tell a different story, but I slightly feel the big ones are slightly behind the curve when it comes to what the digital and electronic media might have to offer. Now, there's no escaping it, and that also includes AI. How will AI come into the equation? And it is coming there. You know, a lot of books are being generated purely by AI that are ending up on, you know, or in, you know, publishers' emails and inboxes. And it's a question of whether that is wanted or whether it's sifted out and how you deal with it. But there's no going back now. We're in this world.
I think we've probably
Sorry.
come to the
But
end of the event, haven't we? Have you got something?
I was just going to say, on a cheerier note perhaps, you know, good books are still being published well, and Rachel is an absolute, you know, key example of that. So, well done.
Thank you. And to you.